من هؤلاء السلف؟ هم الصحابة والتابعون لهم بإحسان وأئمة المسلمين كالإمام أحمد بن حنبل ومالك والشافعي وأبي حنيفة وسفيان الثوري والأوزاعي وغيرهم من أئمة المسلمين.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So we're continuing with Marḥaban Yā Dālibal of Shaykh Rabīʿ rahimahullah ta'ala. We got up to this section now where it is talking about نشأة علوم الحديث وتطورها. How did the sciences of hadith first begin? And how did that science develop? How did the sciences of hadith first begin and how did it develop? The Shaykh mentions كان الصحابة رضوان الله عليهم أول من احتاط لحفظ السنة وصيانتها من أن يشوبها شائبة من غيرها أو يتطرق إليها خطر أو خلل، فاتخذوا للرواية عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم منهجا يضمن عدم تسرب أي خلل إليها من طريق السهو أو العمد. The companions, they were the first ones to take care and give importance to the preservation and memorization of the Sunnah, to preserve it from anything coming into it that would harm it, that would detract from it, that would create deficiency within it. They were the first ones to give importance to this affair, to make sure that nothing gets into the Sunnah that would detract or degrade it in any way. So they had a methodology that they implemented in regards to the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which ensured that no harm came into that Sunnah, neither on purpose from somebody nor through negligence or unawareness. So what were the things that they did? Manhajuhum, what was it? أولا تقليل الرواية عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم خوفا من الوقوع في الخطأ والنسيان مما يؤدي إلى شبهة الكذب على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من حيث لا يشعرون. وكان أبو بكر وعمر وعلي وابن مسعود والزبير بن العوام وغيرهم من الصحابة رضي الله عنهم يقلون من الرواية ويحذرون الناس من الإكثار منها. One of the things that the companions used to do in preservation of the Sunnah was that they would limit how much they narrate, fearing that if they just began narrating, they may become casual over it and mistakes may start to creep in to what they are narrating. Errors may creep in to what they are narrating. So one of their methodologies was to be very precise and limited in what they narrated. What they were certain of, what they had precision over, that's what they would narrate. Not just narrate, openly narrate and narrate and narrate, and then without even realizing mistakes and errors are going into those narrations. So that's the first thing they did. They kept a tight guard over the narrations, and they limited and they were very careful about what they narrated. Secondly, and it's even mentioned, the likes of Abu Bakr, Umar, Ali ibn Mas'ud, al-Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, Ridwanullahi alayhim, and others, they used to limit what they used to narrate, and they used to warn the people from just opening up narrations, meaning just narrating and narrating and narrating, and therefore errors and mistakes falling into that. They used to warn the people, be careful. Secondly, the second thing that they used to do to preserve the Sunnah. ثانيا التثبت من الرواية عند أخذها وأدائها. That they would verify the narrations that they were hearing and taking from others, and what they were reporting and narrating themselves. They would absolutely verify the authenticity of those narrations. قال الإمام الذهبي في ترجمة أبي بكر رضي الله تعالى عنه. الإمام الذهبي, famous scholar from 700-800 years ago, al-Imam al-Dhahabi, he mentioned in the biography of Abu Bakr, because this Imam al-Dhahabi has a big book that he wrote with the biographies of the famous people of the past, companions and others and scholars. So he wrote in the biography of Abu Bakr radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, وكان أول من احتاط في قبول الأخبار. فروى ابن شهاب عن قبيصة ابن ذويل أن الجدة جاءت إلى أبي بكر رضي الله عنه تلتمس أن تورث، فقال: ما أجد لك في كتاب الله شيئا. ثم سأل الناس، فقام المغيرة بن شعبة فقال: حضرت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يعطيها السدس، فقال: هل معك أحد؟ فشهد محمد بن مسلمة لمثل ذلك، فأنفذه لها أبو بكر رضي الله عنه. Al-Imam al-Dhahabi said that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu was the first one who checked narrations, verified and checked narrations. He was the first one who began to do that. And all of that to preserve the Sunnah so that no mistakes occur. People don't narrate something and make a mistake in it by accident. He began verifying and checking the narrations. He was the first to do that. And there's an example where it's mentioned a grandmother came to Abu Bakr. A grandmother came to Abu Bakr wanting to get her share of inheritance. Somebody had died in her family, etc. She wanted to get her share of the inheritance. Abu Bakr said, I do not know of any share for you mentioned in the book of Allah. I do not know of any portion that is for you as the grandma in the book of Allah. Then Abu Bakr asked the other companions who were there about that issue of inheritance. Does she get anything? So al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah, he stood up, or he said, he stood up and he said, I was with the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and I witnessed him giving the grandmother in the inheritance a sixth. You know, with inheritance, there are different amounts. Different people get a sixth, a third, a quarter, etc. He said that I was there with the Messenger and he had apportioned a sixth. So then Abu Bakr said to him, do you have anybody with you? Meaning to confirm this narration of yours that the Messenger had apportioned a sixth. So then it's mentioned Muhammad ibn Maslama. He testified to that. He said, yes, I also can confirm it was a sixth, the Messenger said. So then after Abu Bakr had verified that fact, he then implemented it, knowing now that this is what the Messenger had apportioned. He had verified it now. He then gave her a sixth. So that is an example of where Abu Bakr as-Siddiq first checked the narrations and verified the Sunnah and then implemented it. This is a narration that is in Abu Dawood. It's mentioned in Sunan Abi Dawood. Some of the scholars though do say it is possibly not established, this narration, that it is perhaps weak. The Shaykh al-Albani mentioned perhaps this narration is weak, but it's not a narration that affects in terms of the hadith, in religion, in aqidah, in those affairs. This is a narration about Abu Bakr and what he did. But it just simply highlights the point of verifying the Sunnah. But of course other scholars, they say it's a legitimate narration and they use this as an example of how verification began at the time of the companions, at the time of Abu Bakr himself doing it. وَإِذَنْ فَنَشْأُ هَذَا الْعِلْمِ قَدْ بَدَأَ مِنْ عَهْدِ الصَّحَابَةِ وَلَا زَالَ يَنْمُو وَتَتَّسِعْ دَائِرَتُهُ فِي أَذْهَانِ أَهْلِ الْعِلْمِ. So this knowledge, this issue of narrations and verification, it began at the time of the companions. It began with Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu, and then after that, as time went by, this knowledge began to increase and increase. This science of hadith and verification and narrators, it became more and more recognized and known amongst the companions, amongst the Salaf. So it began at the time of the companions, verification, and it continued on in that way until حتى جاء عصر التدوين. So then, eventually, we come across the time period among the Salaf where they began to write everything down. Because initially, the companions, they used to hear hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They would write down some of those hadith that they heard. Another companion would write down some of the hadith he heard. Another one would write down some of the ones he heard. They all used to write down their bits and bobs of hadith that they had heard from the Messenger. But nobody had gone around and collected all of these bits from all the companions to compile them into a book of hadith. That happened a bit later on. That then happened a little bit later on, where in the time of the Salaf, in the time of the Tabi'een, etc., that's what they then did. They then gathered all of the Sunnah from the narrators and compiled it into books. Prior to that, it was known to the companions and the Tabi'een, and it was memorized and they had narrations, but nobody had gone around collecting it all to compile it. But eventually that's what happened. That's the third stage here, that eventually that time came where they began to gather all of the narrations from the different companions and narrators and compile them together. فبدأ يساير تدوين الحديث ويواكبه جنبا إلى جنب وإن كان في دائرة ضيقة وموزعا هنا وهناك. So initially when they began doing that, when they began compiling the narrations, even then initially it wasn't straight away into big books. Even then initially it was small amounts. They went and gathered from here, from there, they put it together. They began making the small compilations. They began writing down those narrations. So they were spread around. Maybe some companions had a bunch of narrations, other companions had a bunch of narrations written down. So compilations started to happen. قال الشيخ محمد عبد الرزاق حمزة رحمه الله: هذا وقد كتب العلماء فيه من عصر التدوين إلى يومنا هذا نفائس ما يكتب، من ذلك ما تجده في أثناء مباحث الرسالة للإمام الشافعي، وفي ثنايا الأم له، وما نقله تلاميذ الإمام أحمد في أسئلتهم ومحاوراتهم معه، وما كتبه الإمام مسلم بن الحجاج في مقدمة صحيحه، ورسالة الإمام أبي داود السجستاني إلى أهل مكة في بيان طريقته في سننه الشهيرة. So now in those early days we began to see compilations of these affairs and details of this science of narrations and verification and authenticity. And so you see that kind of thing, for example, in the book of Al-Imam Shafi'i known as Al-Risala. In there, you'll see sciences of hadith being mentioned. In the book of Al-Imam Shafi'i also, the famous book, Within that, you will see this knowledge of hadith, etc. being mentioned. Also, the students of Al-Imam Ahmad, the Q&A that they had with him, that is found in books. The Q&A that they used to do with Al-Imam Ahmad and asking him about hadith, etc., that is recorded in books. And also Al-Imam Muslim, when he put together Sahih Muslim, at the beginning of Sahih Muslim there is the Muqaddimah. In that Muqaddimah, that introduction, there is a whole amount of information about sciences of hadith, about the riwayat and the ruwat, the narrators and narrations and verification and asanid. A lot of details are there in the Muqaddimah of Al-Imam Muslim. And also the small treatise that Abu Dawood, Al-Imam Abu Dawood wrote to the people of Mecca, clarifying his methodology in his book Sunan Abi Dawood. Also, ما كتبه الحافظ أبو موسى الترمذي في كتابه العلل المفردة في آخر جامعه، وما بثه في الكلام على أحاديث جامعه في طيات الكتاب من تصحيح وتضعيف وتقوية وتعليل. Also Al-Imam al-Tirmidhi, if you look at some of his works in the Sunan al-Tirmidhi and other places, he has a lot of speech regarding the sciences of hadith and chains of narration and verification and authentic narrations being authentic or narrations being weak. All of that is mentioned in his works as well. And then you have Al-Imam al-Bukhari too. Al-Imam al-Bukhari, he has التواريخ الثلاثة. There are the books of Al-Imam al-Bukhari, Tarikh al-Imam al-Bukhari. There is the small one, the medium one, the large one. In those books, again, he talks about al-Jarh al-Ta'dil, al-Asanid, wal-Ruwat, and these kinds of things, Ulum al-Hadith, mentions all of that in his book. حتى جاء من بعدهم فجرد هذه القواعد في كتب مستقلة ومصنفات عدة أشار إلى أشهرها الحافظ ابن حجر في فاتحة نخبة الفكر. So these early scholars at that time, the ones we just mentioned, within their books, they added in sections on sciences of hadith, about narrators, about chains of narration, about how to verify, all of those kind of things. They used to mention that within their books. Then after them, there came along scholars who put together books specifically just on that subject of sciences of hadith. Specifically just on that topic. Whereas these previous scholars were writing books about other things, but they had chapters or sections in there talking about it. Afterwards came some of the scholars who specified certain books of theirs where they talked about just the science of hadith. And al-Hafiz ibn Hajar mentioned some of those scholars at the beginning of his book Nukhbatul Fikr, which is on the sciences of hadith. فقال رحمه الله, so he mentioned, فمن أول من صنف في ذلك القاضي أبو محمد الرامهرمزي الحسن بن عبد الرحمن الذي عاش إلى قريب 360 في كتابه المحدث الفاصل لكنه لم يستوعبه. So the first one they mention is a scholar by the name of Abu Muhammad al-Ramahurmuzi. That he was one of the first, if not the first, to compile sciences of hadith together into a book, Al-Muhaddith Al-Fasil. But he didn't get everything together in there, but he mentioned a lot. وَالْحَاكِمْ أبو عبد الله النيسابوري لكنه لم يهذب ولم يرتب. Also Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi, he also compiled on the field of sciences of hadith. وتلاهما أبو نعيم الأصبهاني فعمل على كتابه مستخرجا وأبقى أشياء. Then there was Abu Nu'aym al-Asbahani, who came and worked on that previous book. ثم جاء بعدهم الخطيب أبو بكر البغدادي. Abu Bakr al-Khatib Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has a famous book known as Al-Kifaya, which is in the sciences of hadith. في آدابها كتابا سماه وفي آدابها كتابا سماه الجامع لآداب الشيخ والسامع. Also, he has another book talking about the etiquettes of narrations of the student with his sheikh and various affairs in another separate book. وَقَلَّ فَنٌّ مِّن فُنُونِ الْحَدِيثِ إِلَّا وَقَدْ صُنِّفَ فِيهِ كِتَابًا مُفْرَدًا. And there is hardly any science of hadith except that there is a specific book written about that aspect of the sciences of hadith. وكان كما قال الحافظ أبو بكر بن نطة كل من أنصف علم أن المحدثين بعد الخطيب عيال على كتبه. That if you are just, you know that every scholar of hadith who came after al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, they are dependent upon his books. ثم جاء بعدهم بعض من تأخر عن الخطيب فأخذ من هذا العلم بنصيب فجمع القاضي عياض كتابا لطيفا سماه الإيماء وأبو حفص الميانجي جزءا سماه ما لا يسع المحدث جهله وأمثال ذلك من التصانيف التي اشتهرت وبسطت ليتوفر علمها واختصرت ليسهل فهمها. And there are many other books throughout history that continued to be written. And so Al-Qadi Iyad, he had a very small book he wrote about that. Abu Hafs al-Mayaniji, he put together a book with the title Affairs that a Muhaddith cannot be ignorant of. That was the title of his book, and he inserted within that various principles of sciences of hadith. The title Affairs that a Muhaddith cannot be ignorant of, cannot be negligent of. And there were many other books that were written. One of the other famous ones, Abu Amr Uthman ibn Salah. He has a book in this science of hadith. And then the Shaykh goes on, he mentions a whole list, in fact, a whole list of books going through, highlighting that throughout history, the scholars have written multiple books on hadith. Many books on hadith, one after the next, on the sciences of hadith. And in fact, insha'Allah ta'ala, if I remember and I'm able, next week I'll bring all of these books so everybody can see what these books are. Have a look at them, have a look at the authors, al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, al-Nisaburi, al-Ramurmuzi. All of them, have a look at them to see what they are, what they wrote in them, the chapters. Insha'Allah ta'ala, if possible, next week we'll try and do that. So there are multiple books throughout history on the sciences of hadith, because that is all from the preservation of the sunnah. The preservation of the sunnah. To know about the principles. How do you determine if a narrator is valid, legitimate, can be taken from, or whether a narrator is unreliable and cannot be taken from? How do you know if this chain of narration is legitimate? How do you know if this narrator actually heard from that narrator? All of these various things working out. This narrator, did he ever go to the land where that other narrator lived? If he didn't, then when did he ever hear from him? Did they meet in Hajj maybe instead? Various things and details they would look into carefully to judge whether a chain of narration is valid, to judge whether that narrator is legitimate. Sometimes you can have narrators, they are reliable narrators, but at the end of their lives, they began mixing up narrations. So you see sometimes in the books of hadith, they say so-and-so, reliable narrator, but he mixed up things at the end of his lifetime. Which would mean that when you get a chain of narration and his name is in it, you need to check, when did he narrate this hadith? Was it at the beginning or middle of his lifetime, or was it at the end of his lifetime? If it was at the end of his lifetime, you need to start double checking it now. Because they mentioned he began to mix things up towards the end of his lifetime. If you don't know the details of narrators, you might just read somewhere he's reliable. Mark it off as a green tick without realizing, but wait, they said at the end of his lifetime there were a few issues. So now you need to delve in deeper. There are other narrators they mentioned, reliable, no problem, excellent. But he started to mix up his narrations after his library burned down. There are some narrators like that. it mentions that they used to have huge libraries full of chains of narration, thousands, hundreds of thousands, hadith and chains of narrations written down in their books. And it mentions some of them, qaddar Allah, a fire happened in their house, their books burnt down. And after their books burnt down, they hadn't properly memorized every single thing. So after that, when they were narrating, they made a few mistakes. But before the fire, they never used to make mistakes because they could always go and check as well in case. They could check their books and they could check their written down chains of narration, so they always got it accurate. But they mentioned when the fire happened, after that they started to mix things up. So now if you see that person's name in the chain of narration, you need to double check. Was this narration before the house fire when his books burnt down, or was it after? If it was after, you need to double check this one then, just in case he made a mistake. All types of things like that. Sometimes you see in the chain of narration, so-and-so narrated from so-and-so. But they check, and this so-and-so lived in Iraq, and that so-and-so lived in Medina. And there is no narration that the one from Iraq ever went to Medina, or the one from Medina ever went to Iraq. So now they need to look into this further. How did he narrate from him when one lived in Iraq, one lived in Medina, and there's no narration in their biographies that either one of them ever went to the other place? So now we need to investigate. Did he really narrate from him or not? Because if you can't work out how he narrated from him, where, then it could be that actually he narrated from somebody else who narrated from him. Maybe there's somebody missing in the chain. All of these details have to be looked into. Sometimes there is even the issue of at-tadlis, where there could be different reasons. Maybe sometimes there could be a narrator. This is just an example. Maybe there's a narrator and he heard a particular hadith from another narrator, but that other narrator who he heard from was a youngster. Maybe he was 20 years old, and this sheikh was 60 years old. And it just so happened that 20-year-old had gone and met with some other sheikh and narrated a particular hadith that this 60-year-old sheikh had never narrated. So the only time he ever got to get that hadith was from this 20-year-old. So now this 60-year-old sheikh might feel a bit shy in his chain of narration to say that I narrate this hadith from that Khalid, whoever he is, Muhammad, whoever he is, and he's a 20-year-old. Maybe he feels a bit shy. So sometimes what they might do is, so let's imagine his name is Muhammad, the son of Khalid. Muhammad, the son of Khalid. He's 20 years old. And this sheikh was 60, 70 years old. So he feels a bit shy to write in the chain of narration that he narrated from him, because the person you narrate from, he was considered your teacher, then he's considered your sheikh. So he's 70, he's 20, he feels a bit shy. So his name is, for example, Muhammad ibn Khalid al-Qurashi, for example. He might put down in his chain of narration, okay, so I narrated this hadith from Muhammad al-Qurashi. His name was Muhammad, the son of Khalid al-Qurashi. So he puts down, okay, I narrated from Muhammad al-Qurashi. But he doesn't put down Khalid. He doesn't put down Muhammad, the son of Khalid al-Qurashi, because there just so happens to be another famous sheikh called Muhammad ibn Ali al-Qurashi, who's 80 years old, big old sheikh. So he just puts down Muhammad al-Qurashi, and somebody coming along might think he must be talking about that elderly sheikh. He can't be talking about Muhammad ibn Khalid al-Qurashi, who was barely 20 years old. So it's not lying. He's told the truth. He narrated from Muhammad al-Qurashi. He's Muhammad al-Qurashi. But he knows that if he leaves out the son of Khalid al-Qurashi, and I'm making these up just to give examples, if he leaves that out, then people might just assume it's Muhammad ibn Ali, for example, al-Qurashi, who was the elderly sheikh. So just to maybe avoid a little bit of embarrassment, sometimes they might do that. They're not lying, it's completely true. And afterwards, when the scholars investigate, they know which one it is and who he narrated from. But that's known as tadlis. That's just one example. There are so many different parts to tadlis. So that needs to be investigated, because now you come across a chain of narration, Muhammad al-Qurashi. So he looks over there, okay, must be him. So he's reliable narrator. Or maybe he's only an average narrator. He's only maybe an average narrator. Maybe that 20-year-old was a proper reliable narrator. But you assume it's this one. So now all of a sudden you start giving the ruling to the hadith that it's reasonable acceptability. When really the hadith should be full acceptability, because he actually narrated from the young Qurashi who was completely reliable. So you need to know exactly who these narrators are in the chains, because their names can get mixed up. There are even narrators who had exactly identical names. And one might be a reliable narrator, one might not be so good. You need to know exactly which one it is in the chain of narration. And so there's so much that goes into all of that science of hadith, to then be able to finally verify this hadith is authentic, this hadith is weak. And that's what scholars, the muhaddithun, they spent their lives doing. Now, Shaykh al-Albani, from the most recent ones, known as the muhaddith of this era, that's what he did. He has a huge book, al-Sahiha wal-Da'ifa. Huge book. These shelves, it would take up 3 or 4 of those shelves. Huge book. Volumes and volumes big, where he has researched exactly what we're talking about there now. Hadith upon hadith upon hadith, researching, checking. And that's not the only one. He has multiple other books where he carried on doing that. Checked so many hadith. Checked their chains of narration. Checked who the narrators are. Checked every detail to verify, is it authentic, is it not? So that is what the sciences of hadith is, and that's what's being spoken about here. That's the kind of topic that we're on now here. We'll have to stop short today. But next week we'll get the full time again, because Maghrib will be coming back and back. Next week we'll start straight after Maghrib, so we should be able to start at 6:15 inshallah. Maghrib will be around 6. So today is slightly short, but next week inshallah ta'ala we'll have the full class again, start straight after Maghrib next Sunday inshallah.